Tuesday morning hit Charlotte like a cold wave. No warning, no discussion, just a crisp, printed memo slid across the conference table like an unwanted verdict. Accept a 40% pay cut or pack your belongings and leave. Charlotte's heart sank as she stared at the paper. At 35, she had been a senior financial analyst at Nova Tech Solutions for nearly 9 years. She'd walked into that vibrant, bustling office fresh out of college, full of hope and determination. Always the first to arrive and last to leave. Charlotte was the kind of employee who never missed a deadline and once single-handedly revamped the company's entire financial forecasting model during a major product crisis. She believed in hard work, loyalty, and the promise of mutual respect. Nova Tech was the quintessential fast-growing tech startup, open-plan offices filled with energy, walls lined with inspirational quotes, and cold brew coffee on tap. Investors celebrated every quarterly spike. And on paper, the future looked bright. But beneath the sleek surface, Charlotte had started noticing unsettling irregularities, vendor payments that didn't align with invoices, secret slush funds hiding in fresh budget lines, and employee salaries that seemed artificially lowered under the guise of equity shares. Though audits weren't her responsibility, these numbers whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. That morning, her direct manager, Ryan, impeccably dressed but oozing condescension, sat opposite her, wearing a practiced mask of concern. "This isn't personal," he said with a rehearsed calmness. But Charlotte knew the truth. They were pushing her out because she had dared to ask too many questions. Because she refused to stay silent. Clutching the memo, Charlotte left the room with a knot in her stomach but clarity in her mind. Something inside her shifted, not out of anger, but a quiet, burning resolve. This was no longer just about her job. It was about exposing a deeper truth that Nova Tech desperately wanted buried. Charlotte sat at her desk, the memo still folded neatly in her palm, as the hum of Novatech's open office buzzed around her, but she felt miles away. The morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows on the sleek desks and glass partitions. To everyone else, she was just another employee, quietly typing away. But inside, a storm was brewing. For months now, Charlotte had sensed the cracks beneath Novatech's glossy surface. It started with small discrepancies in vendor payments, numbers that didn't quite match invoices, odd budget lines that appeared out of nowhere. Then there were the shadow bonuses, undocumented salary adjustments, and unexplained contractor fees that didn't add up. As a senior financial analyst, she had access to the numbers, but digging deeper was risky. She wasn't part of the audit team, and every question she'd raised before was met with vague answers or cold shoulders. That morning's memo, blunt and brutal, made everything clear. Her persistence had made her a threat. Her direct manager, Ryan, was the architect of her downfall. His thinly veiled contempt was visible every time their paths crossed. "This isn't personal," he'd said, but his tone betrayed him. The truth was, they wanted her silence and her departure. Charlotte took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't naive. She had known for some time the risks of speaking out in a company like Nova Tech. It was a culture that prized growth over transparency, results over integrity. The investors demanded explosive quarterly numbers, and the leadership was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to deliver. She had walked these halls believing in loyalty, but loyalty was a one-way street here. The hours that followed were heavy with silence. Her coworkers avoided eye contact. Whispers died as she approached, and even the interns who used to seek her guidance gave her a wide berth. It was as if she had become a ghost in a place she had helped build. Charlotte opened her laptop, not to check emails, but to pull up her private spreadsheet, the archive of everything she'd quietly been tracking. The numbers were stark. Payments to vendors that couldn't be traced in the state registries. Consulting fees funneled to ghost companies operating out of residential addresses. And dozens of employees listed with suspiciously reduced pay hidden under the guise of equity packages. It was beyond cutting costs. This was systemic fraud. Her hands trembled as she reviewed the evidence. She had wrestled with guilt. Why hadn't she acted sooner? Why had she chosen silence over confrontation? The answers were complex: fear, exhaustion, the weight of being labeled too intense or not a team player in the past. But now, something inside her hardened. This was no longer about protecting herself. It was about accountability. That evening, long after the office had emptied, Charlotte sat in a quiet corner of the local library, Using a public computer disconnected from Novatech's network, she cross-referenced payments, compiled documents, and drafted emails to herself with subject lines like, "If anything happens to me, read this." The gravity of what she was doing settled around her like a second skin. Back at home, sleep was elusive. Her mind replayed Ryan's cold smirk, the quiet dismissal in every meeting, the subtle isolation, but alongside the anxiety was a steely determination. She wasn't going to back down. The next day, Charlotte returned to work, acting as if nothing had changed. She ignored the HR emails about the deadline to accept the pay cut. She didn't respond to Ryan's assistant when asked to check in. She simply logged in, sipped her coffee, and waited. By noon, the first signs of retaliation surfaced. Her access to the company's central ledger was revoked without explanation. Files she had maintained for years suddenly became restricted. The dashboards she had painstakingly built were locked away behind digital walls. It was a calculated, surgical cutoff. Colleagues averted their gaze. Conversations hushed when she entered the room. The atmosphere thickened with tension and unspoken judgment. Charlotte felt like an exile in a kingdom she'd helped crown. Yet she showed up every day, wearing a polite smile and a mask of calm. She took meeting notes, participated quietly, played the role of the defeated employee. But beneath the surface, her mind raced. Each evening, she returned to the library, compiling evidence, cross-referencing vendor registrations with payments, tracing consultant fees, documenting salary mismatches. She knew the risks, but she also knew that silence was complicity. Weeks passed. The pressure mounted. The once vibrant office was now a place of whispered rumors and nervous glances. Then, one Thursday morning, the storm broke. Charlotte noticed a new face at the front desk, a man in a dark blazer. Badge reading, Department of Labor, Division of Enforcement. Her heart skipped. Word spread fast. More officials arrived, armed with laptops and clipboards. A quiet but unmistakable sense of purpose. Department heads were pulled into closed-door meetings. Files began disappearing into boxes. Laptops were confiscated. The company was under federal investigation. Ryan, the man who orchestrated her downfall, was visibly unraveling. His arrogance crumbled into frantic pacing, whispered phone calls, and sweat-soaked meetings. Charlotte watched from her desk, a mix of vindication and sorrow swirling inside her. Days later, Charlotte received an encrypted email from the Department of Labor, inviting her to meet as a confidential informant. She was no longer just a whistleblower. She was a key witness in a federal probe into wage theft and financial fraud. Meeting with the lead investigator, Charlotte learned she wasn't alone. Others had tried to speak up but were silenced, dismissed, forced out, or mysteriously vanished. This time, however, the case had real weight. Her meticulously gathered evidence was the foundation. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of subpoenas, frozen access to shared drives, and sudden resignations. The company's facade cracked under the pressure. Charlotte stayed in character, blending into the background while knowing she was at the eye of the storm. Then came the moment that changed everything. Late one evening, as the office emptied, Charlotte received an email sent to a select group of senior analysts, including herself. Though technically no longer in that circle, the subject line was mundane, about Q3 disbursement adjustments. But inside lay a bombshell. Ryan's detailed plan to hide consultant bonuses and discretionary funds to evade audits. Complete with doctored spreadsheets, her own, manipulated and falsified. She forwarded the email and original files to the investigator immediately. Within minutes, the reply came. "This is it." Charlotte felt a wave of clarity and resolve. The endgame wasn't just about the company or Ryan, it was about reclaiming her voice, her worth, and her integrity. The next morning, federal agents arrived in force, seizing files and detaining Ryan at the front lobby. He was escorted out, defeated and exposed. Charlotte quietly packed her belongings that afternoon. Her resignation was simple, no dramatics, just closure. Walking out the revolving doors, hand on the cool glass, she breathed in the weight of what had passed, the end of a chapter marked by betrayal, courage, and painful growth. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: she had reclaimed herself. Charlotte had braced herself for fallout, but nothing could have prepared her for the silence that followed the initial federal sweep at Novatech. The days after Ryan's arrest felt surreal. The usual office buzz was replaced by a tense hush, punctuated by whispered speculation and stolen glances. It was as if the entire company was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yet, Charlotte felt strangely isolated. No one reached out, no sympathetic words, no cautious check-ins. The colleagues who once avoided her seemed to avoid even looking in her direction. The interns who had sought her advice suddenly found other mentors, or disappeared entirely. It was as if the office had rewritten its history, erasing her part from the story. That first week, Charlotte kept her head down. She continued to submit reports that felt hollow, attended meetings that felt meaningless, and smiled just enough to blend in. But inside, her mind raced. The investigation was far from over, and she knew the real battle was just beginning. One late afternoon, as rain streaked the windows and the office emptied faster than usual, Charlotte's phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from the Department of Labor's lead investigator. "We need to meet. Urgent. Can you come to the office downtown tomorrow morning?" Her heart pounded, the calm before the next storm. The next day, Charlotte entered the nondescript government building, feeling the weight of every step. The investigator greeted her with a sharp nod. "We've uncovered something new," she said quietly, closing the door behind them. Evidence linking Ryan personally to the fraudulent schemes, emails, financial transfers, directives only he could have authorized. Charlotte's throat tightened. This was the breakthrough they needed. But then came the twist. "We also found traces of a deeper network. Senior executives, possibly board members, who may have been complicit or willfully blind." The investigator added, "We're expanding the probe. It's bigger than we thought." Charlotte's world shifted. The man she'd thought was the villain might only be a piece of a much larger puzzle. Back at Nova Tech, the atmosphere was crackling with tension. Rumors spread like wildfire, quiet resignations, sudden leaves of absence, legal teams frantically shuffling papers. The glass walls seemed to reflect more fear than light. One afternoon, as Charlotte prepared for another late night at the office, a soft knock startled her. It was Grace, a former colleague she barely knew but who had always seemed to watch quietly from the sidelines. "Charlotte," Grace whispered, glancing around nervously. "I've been trying to reach you." Charlotte's heart skipped. "I have documents," Grace said, sliding a small envelope across the desk. "Proof of payments, emails. I was afraid to speak up before, but now I can't stay silent." Charlotte took the envelope, hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. She glanced inside, handwritten notes, printouts of transactions, internal memos. This was the kind of evidence that could widen the investigation. Together, they started piecing together the hidden layers of deceit, mapping out a web of corruption stretching far beyond Ryan's office. But the risks grew. The closer they got to the truth, the more isolated they became. Charlotte noticed that her emails were occasionally delayed or missing. Strange glitches on her computer. Unexplained interruptions during meetings. The message was clear. Some wanted them silenced. Late one night, after hours, Charlotte received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted. "Stop digging, Charlotte. You don't know what you're getting into." Her blood ran cold, but fear no longer controlled her. Instead, it fueled her resolve. The investigation took a public turn when news outlets caught wind of the federal probe. Headlines screamed about wage theft, financial fraud, and corporate scandals. Novatech's stock plummeted. Investors bailed. The company that had once seemed untouchable was unraveling in real time. Charlotte found herself fielding calls from reporters, legal advisors, and even former employees who finally felt safe to speak out. The isolation began to break. Yet, the personal cost was undeniable. Every step forward came with new battles, threats, sleepless nights, strained relationships. She questioned if it was worth it. But each time doubt crept in. She remembered why she started. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless voices drowned out by greed and silence. Then came the turning point. One morning, Charlotte arrived to find an unexpected visitor in the lobby, a woman in a crisp suit with a warm but determined expression. "Charlotte, I'm Julia," she said. "I was Novatech's HR director. I left months ago under difficult circumstances. But I've been following your courage. I have more evidence and stories from others who were silenced." Tears welled up in Charlotte's eyes. She was no longer alone. Together with Julia and Grace, Charlotte began building a coalition of whistleblowers. Their stories painted a damning picture of systemic abuse, retaliation, and cover-ups. The federal investigation deepened. Subpoenas flew. Documents surfaced. and more executives were questioned. Novatech's leadership was exposed, piece by piece. Months later, as the dust settled, Charlotte was invited to speak at a private session with corporate compliance leaders. The invitation was both an honor and a challenge, to share not just her story, but lessons on how companies could change before corruption took root. Standing before the room, Charlotte spoke with quiet strength about the cost of silence, the power of truth, and the urgent need for cultures that listen and protect their people. Her journey, once defined by fear and isolation, had become a beacon of hope for others. Charlotte knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to lead the change she had fought so hard to ignite. Charlotte's world shifted profoundly in the weeks following the explosive revelations at Novatech. The office that once felt like a prison now felt like a battleground, a place where old fears clashed with new hope. But more than anything, Charlotte's own perspective began to change, reshaping how she viewed herself, her colleagues, and the system she had once trusted. For years, Charlotte had believed that loyalty and hard work were the keys to success and safety in the corporate world. She had devoted herself to Novatech with a fierce dedication, convinced that if she did everything right, if she stayed quiet when necessary, she would be rewarded. Instead, she had been blindsided, betrayed by the very people she had trusted. But now, seeing the investigation unfold, meeting other whistleblowers, and hearing stories of silencing and betrayal across industries, Charlotte realized how deeply flawed that belief was. Loyalty, she understood, was a two-way street, and when it was weaponized, it became a tool of control and fear. The first time she acknowledged this out loud was during a private meeting with Julia, the former HR director who had confided in her. "I thought loyalty meant silence," Charlotte admitted, voice heavy with emotion. "But silence is what allowed them to get away with it. Silence protected the wrong people." Julia nodded, her eyes reflecting years of pain. Loyalty to a company doesn't mean sacrificing your integrity. Sometimes, it means standing up even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary. Charlotte began to see her own silence in a new light, not as weakness, but as a symptom of a toxic culture designed to keep voices like hers quiet. And more importantly, she started to understand that breaking that silence was not just an act of courage, it was an act of healing. With this fresh clarity, Charlotte started reaching out, not just to allies, but to those she had once felt distant from. The colleagues who had avoided her now looked at her differently, some with admiration, others with regret. One day, in the cafeteria, she was approached by Elena, a mid-level manager known for her quiet diligence. "Charlotte," Elena said softly, "I always wanted to speak up, but I was afraid. You showed me it's possible. Thank you." The words struck Charlotte harder than she expected. She realized that her journey had already sparked ripples, small but meaningful, in the company's fractured culture. But the change in perspective wasn't limited to how others saw her, it was how she saw herself. Gone was the self-doubt that had haunted her for years, the nagging voice that told her she was too intense, or not a team player. That voice had been drowned out by months of courage, sacrifice, and hard truths. Charlotte's confidence grew not from external praise, but from an internal sense of purpose. She began journaling again, writing not to record pain, but to document lessons learned and hopes for the future. One evening, as she prepared for a meeting with compliance officers from other companies, she paused in front of her reflection. The woman staring back was tired, yes, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a strength born from survival and transformation. She remembered the countless nights spent agonizing over spreadsheets, the crushing isolation, the fear, and she smiled, a real, unguarded smile, the kind that comes from knowing you've come through the fire. Charlotte also began to see the system itself in a new light. She realized that while individuals like Ryan and other executives had exploited the company for personal gain, the larger problem was structural. The culture of unchecked growth, investor pressure, and the silence around unethical behavior created fertile ground for corruption. She understood that fixing one person's wrongdoing wasn't enough. The entire ecosystem needed change. With this in mind, Charlotte started to advocate for systemic reforms, not just within Novatech, but across the industry. She connected with compliance professionals, labor rights activists, and ethical business leaders, sharing insights and pushing for new standards that prioritized transparency, accountability, and employee protection. Her perspective also shifted toward empathy. She recognized that many colleagues who had initially avoided or even opposed her were themselves trapped in fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of losing their livelihoods, fear of rocking the boat. Rather than holding resentment, Charlotte chose compassion. One afternoon, during a team meeting, a junior analyst nervously raised her hand. "Charlotte, how did you find the strength to speak out?" "I'm scared if I do. I'll be next." Charlotte looked at her kindly and said, "Fear is real, and it's okay to feel it. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. And you're not alone. We're stronger together." Her words resonated deeply with the team, many of whom later thanked her for creating a safer space to voice concerns. The transformation wasn't without setbacks. There were days when old wounds resurfaced, when Charlotte grappled with anxiety and doubts. There were meetings where resistance still lingered, where change seemed slow or superficial. But with each challenge, her new perspective anchored her. She stopped measuring her worth by others' approval and instead found validation in her values and actions. Charlotte's change in perspective extended beyond the office, too. She became more mindful in her personal life, prioritizing mental health, building authentic relationships, and setting boundaries she had once ignored. She even rekindled hobbies she'd shelved: painting, hiking, reading, finding joy and balance that had eluded her during the darkest times. The greatest shift, perhaps, was in how Charlotte viewed the future. Instead of fearing uncertainty, she embraced it as an opportunity to build something better. Her story, once defined by betrayal and silence, was now a story of resilience and transformation, a testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and rewriting the narrative. As Charlotte prepared to lead a company-wide listening session, inviting voices from every department to share their experiences without fear, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was not just about exposing wrongdoing or fighting corruption. It was about healing herself, her colleagues, and the culture they were rebuilding together. And in that healing, Charlotte found purpose, a purpose that would guide her through the challenges ahead, and light the way for others still searching for their voice. After months of navigating the storm that had engulfed Nova Tech, Charlotte began to see a new horizon forming. The relentless pressure, the battles fought in silence and in whispers, had taken their toll, but they had also carved a path forward, one she hadn't anticipated but was ready to embrace. The day she received the call from Laurel was the day everything changed. Laurel was the founder of a small, values-driven tech firm named ClearPath Analytics, a company with a reputation for transparency, ethical business practices, and a culture that prioritized people over profits. Charlotte had heard whispers about ClearPath, especially in the wake of Novatech's scandal, as a beacon of hope in an industry often criticized for greed and opacity. Laurel's voice on the phone was warm, calm, and sincere. "Charlotte, I know what you've been through. We've been following your story and the courage you've shown. We'd be honored if you'd consider joining us, not just as a financial analyst, but to help build the kind of culture we've always dreamed of." Charlotte's heart raced. The invitation wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to rebuild from the ground up, to take the lessons she'd learned the hard way and apply them where they could make a difference. Her first day at ClearPath was unlike anything she had experienced in years. The office was modest, no flashy logos, no endless rows of desks, no constant buzz of forced cheer. Instead, it was warm and inviting, with soft lighting, quiet spaces for focused work, and a sense of calm that felt almost foreign. Laurel greeted her personally, eyes meeting Charlotte's with an honest kindness that felt like a balm. "We're glad you're here. Take your time. No pressure to prove anything," she said. The atmosphere was unlike the high-pressure, performance-obsessed environment Charlotte had left behind. Here, people listened. They respected boundaries. They encouraged questions and welcomed feedback. The culture wasn't built on fear or silence, it was built on trust. At ClearPath, Charlotte was given a role that went beyond traditional finance. She was tasked with helping design internal policies that fostered transparency and fairness, creating safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. It was work she had never imagined herself doing, but it felt deeply meaningful. She worked closely with Laurel and a small team to draft guidelines focused on ethical reporting, mental health support, and accountability measures. Every suggestion Charlotte made was met with openness, not skepticism. Meetings were collaborative, not competitive. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt her voice mattered, not just because of her expertise, but because the company truly valued integrity. The transition wasn't without challenges. Old habits die hard, and sometimes Charlotte caught herself hesitating to speak up, afraid of being seen as difficult. But ClearPath's culture was different. When she raised concerns, they were met with nods, questions, and follow through. The fear that had once shadowed her every move began to lift. One afternoon, while reviewing a vendor contract, Charlotte noticed a clause that seemed ambiguous and potentially exploitable. She flagged it during a team meeting. "Thanks for catching that," a junior analyst whispered as they packed up. "I was afraid to question it." The moment resonated deeply with Charlotte. That simple acknowledgement underscored how much fear still lingered in corporate environments, even in places striving to be better. Determined to foster real change, Charlotte began organizing informal listening sessions where employees could share their experiences and concerns openly. These meetings were voluntary and confidential, offering a rare space for honesty. At first, attendance was small, people were guarded, wary of potential repercussions, but slowly, as trust grew, more voices joined. Stories surfaced about microaggressions, burnout, unclear expectations, and the invisible pressures that chipped away at well-being. Charlotte listened without judgment, taking notes and working with leadership to address issues thoughtfully. It wasn't about quick fixes or grand announcements. It was about building a foundation of respect and care. Brick by brick, the transformation was gradual but powerful. Charlotte's own healing deepened as she saw how these changes impacted her colleagues. The atmosphere in the office grew lighter, more collaborative. People smiled genuinely, took breaks without guilt, and felt empowered to raise concerns. Outside of work, Charlotte's life began to bloom too. The balance she sought started to take shape. She rekindled old friendships, explored new hobbies, and allowed herself moments of rest and joy without guilt. The scars of her past experiences remained, but they no longer defined her. One crisp morning, Laurel approached Charlotte with a proposal. "We're forming a leadership team focused on compliance and culture," she said. "We want you to lead it." Charlotte was stunned, not by the offer, but by what it represented. It wasn't just a job title or a promotion. It was a chance to shape the future, to ensure that ClearPath remained a place where integrity wasn't just a buzzword, but a lived reality. She took a moment, letting the weight of the responsibility settle. Then she nodded. "I accept," she said softly. Her first act as the leader of compliance and culture wasn't a grand announcement or sweeping policy change. Instead, she invited every department, no matter how small, to send one representative to a listening session. There were no agendas, no pressure, just space. At first, the sessions were quiet, tentative. People shared guarded stories and small frustrations. But as weeks passed, trust deepened. Stories became richer and more personal, about burnout, microaggressions, unclear boundaries, and hidden fears. Charlotte and her team documented everything carefully. Not to punish, but to understand. They began crafting policies that addressed these concerns, clearer communication channels, mental health resources, transparent performance reviews, and ongoing education about workplace respect. The work was painstaking, slow, but necessary. Some days, Charlotte felt the old ache, the shadow of the woman she had been before the storm. But then she'd see an intern raise a question without hesitation, or a manager ask how to lead with empathy instead of fear. And she'd know this was progress. One afternoon, as Charlotte prepared to leave the office, she caught her reflection in the glass doors, tired eyes, windblown hair, and a calm she hadn't known in years. She didn't just look like someone who had survived. She looked like someone who had returned to herself. Charlotte's journey through the aftermath of the Nova Tech scandal was far from over. While she had stepped into a new role at ClearPath Analytics, a place that promised healing and renewal, the true work of growth stretched beyond policy changes and leadership titles. It was an internal evolution, a reawakening of spirit, courage, and self-worth that had been buried beneath years of silence and suppression. At first, the transition was difficult, even in ClearPath's supportive environment. Old fears and habits lingered. Charlotte found herself second-guessing her voice, hesitating before raising concerns, and sometimes retreating into quietude when pressure mounted. The ghosts of past betrayals whispered doubts. Was she too much? Was she risking too much again? Would history repeat itself? But slowly, those doubts began to lose their grip. One pivotal moment came during a leadership retreat. The team gathered in a rustic cabin nestled in the woods, away from the glow of city lights and the hum of office chatter. The purpose was clear: to deepen trust, build authentic connections, and reflect on their shared mission. Charlotte sat by the fire, surrounded by colleagues she now considered allies, when Laurel asked the group to share stories of struggle and resilience. Charlotte hesitated, then spoke with raw honesty. I spent years believing that silence was safer, that loyalty meant enduring, even when it hurt, but silence became my prison. It stole my voice, my confidence, my peace. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. But healing, she continued, has been about reclaiming that voice. It's about embracing vulnerability as strength, not weakness. I'm learning that growth isn't linear. It's messy, hard, and sometimes painful, but it's necessary. The circle nodded, some wiping away tears, others smiling with quiet understanding. That night, Charlotte journaled by the dim light of her cabin room. She wrote about her fears, her hopes, and the unexpected courage blossoming inside her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself grace, to be imperfect, to stumble, to learn. Back in the office, Charlotte's growth showed in tangible ways. She became more assertive in meetings, speaking up not only about compliance issues but also about mental health, team dynamics, and the importance of empathy in leadership. Her colleagues noticed. Grace, the junior analyst who had once whispered thanks for Charlotte's vigilance, now looked to her for guidance and mentorship. During a one-on-one, Grace confessed, "You've helped me find my own voice. I feel like I belong." Charlotte smiled, realizing her growth had rippled outward, inspiring others to step into their own power. Yet, growth wasn't without setbacks. One afternoon, Charlotte received a critical email from a senior executive questioning the necessity of certain new policies she'd championed. The tone was thinly veiled skepticism, a reminder that not everyone welcomed change. Instead of retreating, Charlotte crafted a thoughtful response, grounded in data, empathy, and clear communication. She invited dialogue rather than conflict, seeking to understand concerns while affirming her commitment to ethical leadership. This approach slowly shifted perspectives, turning skeptics into allies. Charlotte also embraced self-care in ways she never had before. She set boundaries around work hours, practiced mindfulness, and leaned on a therapist to unpack layers of trauma and stress accumulated over years. These practices fortified her resilience, helping her navigate challenges with calm and clarity. Outside work, Charlotte reconnected with passions that nourished her soul. She picked up painting again, finding peace in the swirl of colors and brushstrokes. Weekends were spent hiking in nature, where the quiet beauty reminded her of life's bigger picture beyond office walls. Her friendships deepened, anchored in authenticity and mutual support. With every step, Charlotte shed the weight of past wounds, embracing a fuller, freer version of herself. Her leadership style evolved too. Gone was the desire to prove herself through perfection or endurance. Instead, she led with compassion, vulnerability, and a fierce dedication to creating safe spaces for others. One memorable day, Charlotte facilitated a workshop on courageous conversations, where team members practiced speaking honestly about difficult topics. As participants shared stories of fear and hope, Charlotte saw the transformative power of vulnerability in real time. It was a testament to how far she, and the company culture, had come. The crescendo of Charlotte's growth was not a dramatic moment but a series of quiet victories: a junior employee speaking up in a meeting, a manager adjusting leadership style to be more inclusive, a team resolving conflicts with empathy rather than avoidance. Charlotte understood that real growth was about influence, not control, connection, not command. She became a beacon of resilience, not because she was flawless, but because she showed up authentically, flaws and all. In reflecting on her journey, Charlotte realized that growth was not a destination but a lifelong process. It demanded courage to face the past, compassion to heal, and conviction to build anew. Most importantly, it required trusting herself, to speak, to act, and to lead from a place of integrity. And with that trust, Charlotte knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Charlotte stood at the edge of a crowded conference room, the soft murmur of voices swirling around her as leaders from various companies gathered for a closed session on corporate ethics and compliance. It was a moment she had never imagined, just a year ago. She was fighting for her own voice, silenced and isolated in the halls of Nova Tech. Now, here she was, invited to share her story, not as a victim, but as a beacon of change. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte began to speak. Her voice was steady, but underneath, it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every quiet battle, every moment of doubt transformed into resolve. I wasn't looking for a hero's journey, she said, scanning the room. I was just trying to survive. But survival taught me something profound, that silence isn't safety. It's a cage, and breaking free isn't about loud protests or grand gestures. Sometimes, it starts with a whisper. She shared the story of her years at Nova Tech, the loyalty she gave, the red flags she ignored, the moment she chose to speak out, and the loneliness that followed. But she also spoke about the power of resilience, the importance of integrity, and the courage it takes to hold onto your truth when the world tries to bury it. Her words struck a chord. The room grew still. Leaders nodded, some with tears glistening in their eyes, others with thoughtful expressions. She was not just telling a story, she was lighting a path. Change isn't easy, Charlotte continued. It demands uncomfortable conversations, tough decisions, and the willingness to face the unknown. But it is possible. We can build cultures that listen, protect, and empower. We can create workplaces where every voice matters. As she finished, applause filled the room, not just polite, but heartfelt. Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude and humility. This was more than a speech, it was a call to action. Back at ClearPath Analytics, the momentum from that session rippled outward. Charlotte took the lead in forming a company-wide initiative focused on transparency and employee well-being. It wasn't flashy or grandiose, no big announcements, no sudden policy overhauls. Instead, it was patient, persistent work, listening sessions, anonymous feedback channels, leadership training, and regular check-ins. Day by day, the culture shifted. People who once felt afraid to speak now raised concerns openly. Burnout rates declined. Teams collaborated more effectively. The company thrived not just in numbers, but in spirit. Charlotte's leadership style, rooted in empathy and authenticity, inspired others to lead similarly. She mentored colleagues, encouraged new voices, and championed those who felt unheard. One afternoon, as she walked through the office, an intern approached her nervously. "Charlotte, I just wanted to say thank you," the young woman said shyly. "Because of you, I feel safe to speak up. It means everything." Charlotte smiled, her heart full. Moments like these reminded her why she had fought so hard. The journey had been long, painful, and uncertain, but it had forged something unbreakable. Charlotte had not only survived the storm, she had transformed it into a catalyst for growth, healing, and hope. As she reflected on her path, she realized her story was not unique. So many people stayed silent, trapped by fear or doubt. But each voice, each whisper, had the power to ignite change. She looked forward to a future where courage was contagious, where integrity was celebrated, and where no one had to face injustice alone. Because sometimes, justice starts quietly, with one person choosing to speak out. And that voice, that choice, can change everything. Charlotte's story teaches us that silence, while often tempting for self-preservation, carries a heavy cost. Staying quiet may seem like safety, but it can lead to isolation, guilt, and the perpetuation of injustice. True courage lies not in the absence of fear but in choosing to speak up despite it. Integrity and resilience are forged in those difficult moments when we decide that truth matters more than comfort or convenience. Her journey reminds us that loyalty must be mutual and rooted in respect, not blind obedience. When a system punishes honesty, it's the system that must change, not the brave individuals who risk everything to uphold what's right. If you find yourself in a situation where you suspect wrongdoing or unethical behavior, take heart in Charlotte's example. Start by quietly documenting what you observe, dates, emails, discrepancies, creating a clear record. Seek trusted allies who share your concerns and explore safe channels for reporting. Remember, you don't have to fight alone. Many organizations, both governmental and nonprofit, offer confidential support for whistleblowers. And sometimes, the first step is simply finding the courage to say, "This isn't right." Creating change takes time and often requires patience and resilience. But by speaking up, you become part of a larger movement toward transparency and justice, protecting not only yourself but those who may come after. Your voice matters. Sometimes, it's the whisper that ignites the revolution. Thank you for choosing to listen to this story among thousands of stories out there. Like and subscribe to continue listening to the latest stories.